introduce them very briefly. I think you have everyone's bios. And I'll turn to them in just a moment to start the discussion. I hope you'll ask us questions too. We're happy to talk about any aspect of the book. So thank you again for joining us. Here's Jennifer. Anybody needs a book, let us know. So I edited this book. This came from a writing seminar that I teach at Georgetown Law School called International Trade, Development, and the Common Good. I've been teaching this class since 2008. And I can say that the world has changed a lot since 2008. And I feel like we're at a place right now where we need fresh, innovative thinking about where we go from here. And so that was part of the impetus behind this book. This is the second book that we published through our center, CITD. The first one we launched here last year on using trade tools to fight climate change, that my colleague, Jennifer Hillman, and one of our students, actually, Laurent Damian, had co-edited with student papers. The idea was to just get some of these ideas out there, find a way to promote the work of our students, to get some fresh thinking out into the discussion around what we do on international trade. How do we grapple with this ever increasingly complex, I guess, set of issues and factors that we have to deal with? We had a panel this morning actually that another former student, Emilie, who's taking pictures back there and waiting, and he brought the books here, facilitated, and we were talking about how to teach international trade law. And again, the world has changed so much, so we're no longer teaching international trade law just based on WTO law, even though that remains a foundation of what we do. But now we have to look at so many other things. We have to look at regional trade agreements and the role that they play, how issues like gender and food security and labor and environment and all kinds of complicated things that we had never really talked about, at least not extensively in the context of trade, now are becoming central to the conversation. So my class is really designed around all those issues. It's designed to look at where trade and development intersect. And we start with special and differential treatment, and then we go off into all of these different areas to really think about where we're going. And I think, we see that there is some hard law in these areas. There is some, it's not multilateral law. It's not generally the same as the way that many of us kind of grew up thinking about international trade law. But there is law there, and there's new law emerging all the time in these areas. But there's also a lot of unexplored potential. There are a lot of questions around, should the law do more? Is it really addressing people's needs on the ground? Are we thinking about these new areas in this kind of trade and space in a way that's really going to promote inclusive and sustainable development? Or are we just ticking a box sometimes and trying to put things out there to show that these agreements are sustainable, aligned with the sustainable development goals? How can we really do this in a meaningful way? And I will say that the work of my students, and I think I probably speak for a lot of those of us who teach, is sometimes really path-breaking. I think students will see things that sometimes those of us who have been working on international trade law for many years won't see. They'll see an angle that we're not exploring. Sometimes they'll look at an agreement and say, well, I understand that it's meant to do this, but why can't it do that too? And in raising some of these questions, I think it kind of pushes all of us to think a little bit more outside of the box. So that's really what this project was all about. And again, this is associated with the class. Let me quickly introduce them, and I'll turn to them in just a second. So Emilie, to my left, she's a senior associate in the trade and industrial policy practice at Global Counsel. She works on trade, industrial policy, security, and sustainability. Again, a whole range of issues, so hopefully we prepared her well for all of that with the classes at Georgetown Law. She was a researcher at E3G. She worked with us as a research assistant at our Center on Inclusive Trade and Development, where she remains an affiliated researcher. She worked in different institutions in DC, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, sorry, jet lag and long day, the New Markets Lab, which is a nonprofit that I started in 2010, and she's worked also in a consulting firm in Brussels. So she's done a lot of things already and has a lot to say, and we'll go to her in a second. And Giovanni, to my right, is a PhD researcher in international law at the Geneva Graduate Institute. He's working on some really path-breaking research on the role of trade law in promoting sustainable food systems, He was a Fulbright scholar at Georgetown Law, where he got his LLM. He was also part of the CITD and continues to be affiliated with us as well. And he previously did international arbitration and litigation. So they are, like I said, the stars of the show. I'm going to turn to them in just a second. But again, you know, how do we think about this profound change that's happening in international trade law right now? How do we think about where all these trade agreements, regional trade agreements fit in, new issues coming to the table, and how do we really make this align with sustainable development? I wrote the first chapter in the book thinking about the 3 pillars of sustainable development: economic, social, and environmental, and whether international trade law really covers all 3 of those pillars. Certainly it's very heavy on economic. And even though international trade law refers to sustainable development, it's in the preamble to the WTO, it's in a lot of trade agreements, it still tends to focus more on the economic. And so the way that the book is divided starts with the economic and then moves into social issues to see how we can kind of go deeper on social, because I think if there's a gap, it's probably on the social side. Again, a lot of good intentions out there, but a lot of the provisions aren't very binding, they're sometimes not very specific. So that was one place where I really encouraged everybody in class to explore that social dimension. And then the environmental dimension, I think we're talking about more and more and more, and very, you know, rightly so. But even there too, I think there are more things. So we had student papers on green finance, we had student papers looking at the debt crisis and how that relates to countries' ability to deal with climate change, looking at fisheries subsidies, a whole range of things. But I think both of these papers actually kind of fall a little bit more within the social sphere, where I think, again, we really need to put a lot more attention. And the center that this is associated with, that Jennifer and I co-founded, we really try to bring together the top-down, the law at the highest level, the treaties, you know, WTO law, regional trade agreements, and then this idea of how do we kind of do this more from the bottom up in a way that's going to have a real impact? How do we make sure that all of this is going to change the system in a positive way? We focus on research and writing, teaching, and this project is kind of at the intersection of all of those things. So I think we will probably just dive in, and hopefully you all will explore the rest of the book. We're going to do another version of this now based on the class that I just taught in the spring. So we'll have another round of papers on another round of really exciting topics. And hopefully we'll keep these projects going. So I hope you all see a lot of value in this. And I think, you know, working with all of these amazing students too, I think part of our job is trying to really promote their work and help them get published and help them get their work out there so that they build a foundation that they can continue to expand upon as their careers move forward. So we are going to get into the details in just a moment, but before we talk about their chapters themselves, I thought that maybe I've talked about the project and the class and why I think this is important, but I'd love to turn to them and ask them a little bit why they thought being part of this discussion around how trade rules are evolving is something that's really meaningful for them and how they see this at this stage of their career. So I can turn, maybe Giovanni, I'll turn to you first, since I'll turn to you first, Emily, on the chapters. So maybe just tell us a little bit about, you know, we talk so much here at the WTO too about how to bring in the voices of youth, how to really make sure that we're promoting the work of the next generation. So how do you think that that's working in practice, and how do you see something like this fitting into these bigger initiatives to really amplify your voices? And how can we make this a part of a larger dialogue? I will say too that this book included authors from all over the world. I think one of the challenges that we found too is it's hard to get people to Geneva sometimes. I had a student author from Ghana who really wanted to come and wasn't able to come. We have student authors from India and Japan and all over Asia, from all over Latin America. So this might be one thing that we think about in the future too, is how do we make sure that we really have as many people here as we can to participate in these conversations, because I think Geneva is an amazing place, but I think it's great to have as much of a worldview as we possibly can. So just my last word, Giovanni, I'm going to give you the microphone. Thank you both for doing this and for being here. Thank you all for joining us.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Professor Kuhlmann, for the kind invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. So, to address your question, I think that this book and the initiatives that you and especially Professor Kuhlmann together lead at Georgetown, I think it fit very well also in this broader effort to try to promote the voices of the new generation of trade lawyers. I think this book series that you're having are really a great platform to try to launch the ideas of new students, and you've done this through the book. You do that at Georgetown, also supporting a writing competition, which encourages students to submit papers on trade, and I think it's a good incentive when students are not, let's say, just writing a paper for the sake of the class or for the sake of the grading, but see it as part of a larger effort and something that can reach a broader audience. And it's something that also WTO is trying to do. They also have essays competitions and initiatives like this, which I think can be very effective in stimulating the debate and in giving the voices to, especially to the younger people. And then I also think this book and your class, of course, I think contributed to create kind of a sense of community in the class, precisely because it was not just each student working on his or her own paper, but we were part of a larger effort. We wanted these papers to get out there, and so we also discussed, not only with you, but also among the students in class and outside the class, about what we were writing about our ideas, and so I think that really contributed to create some good bonds. Most of them are still lasting today or years after people have graduated, so I think that's really great. And I think, also if we look at events like this, like the public forum, I think the goal is precisely to keep the community together and to create an environment where people can share ideas and advance their views. And in addition to that, I think another important point of this book is that it really collects a diverse range of voices and perspectives, because our class was truly made of people coming from every corner of the world, and also from people whose, let's say, first background was not law. So we had economists, we had political scientists. I remember we also had an engineering class, so it was very interesting to see how people with different backgrounds then approach legal issues and try to promote solutions that are really out of the box. So I think that that also really sparks some interdisciplinary dialogue, which I think is very important in trying to address the new challenges that the trade community should face, from climate change to food security to the digital transformation. And I think it's important to get a sense of that also when they're students, because then if we look at institutions like the WTO, you have economists, lawyers, political scientists working together. So if you start already in law school learning how to work and to communicate with people that have different backgrounds, I think that's very valuable. And as a last point, perhaps, I also think this book can be very helpful in trying to bridge a bit the gap between academia and policymakers. And I think the possibility of presenting the book in settings like this, where policymakers work, is extremely important, and hopefully somebody will read our chapters and our ideas, and they evolve with the time.
Thank you, Giovanni. That's fantastic. And I love hearing that you think that this inspired a sense of community, because I think we felt that way too. I think in the years that we've been producing these books through our classes, it does feel like they brought everybody together around this shared goal and this shared project. And I like also that you emphasize the interdisciplinary nature. I try to bring that into class, but it's, the students themselves are completely interdisciplinary, which I think is fantastic. So Emilie, I'd like to turn to you for your thoughts on the same question, and then I'll let you keep the microphone, and I'll, actually you'll hand it back to me for just a second to introduce your chapter, but then we'll go into your chapter itself.
So I doubt that there are people in this room who don't know Professor Kuhlmann and Professor Hillman. Yes, we still call them that because it's very strange to call them by their first name when they've been your professor, but there are truly no two greater champions of students' work. I mean, they are what I like to call trade celebrities in their own right. Very, very busy people, and yet they take every time, every moment out of their day to champion their students' work. And I mean, I'm just one example of that. I think this book is just one example of that. Last year I was here as well. When I told the professors that I was moving to Brussels, they said, well, if you're going to be in Brussels, we're going to bring you to the public forum for this book launch of the Trade and Climate book. They said, you have to be there, you have to join us, and it was the most inspiring week. And now I've dedicated myself to coming to the public forum every year, and I scheme ways to ensure that I can be here. But also more than that, beyond the public forum, you know, I've graduated now, and it's been some time, but when I reached out to Professor Kuhlmann, I said, look, there's this great initiative at the WTO. They're setting up a youth trade forum on gender, and I think this would be such a fantastic opportunity. If you think CITB could support me, they'd be like, well, without a doubt, we're happy to send you. We're happy to champion you in this. So just wanted to take the initial moments of my answer to just give a cheers to these two professors for everything they do for their students and continue to do. I think when it comes to this book in particular, it's so important because the barrier to entry for young people is incredibly high. You know, we spend our years in university writing all of these papers, and most of them just end up in a drawer, never to be read by anyone except the professor and perhaps a few classmates. And what this book allows is for these papers to be read by other people, and that's important because there are good ideas in these books. It's not because, you know, you're still at the beginning of your career or still in your, you know, legal or other education that you can't have good or original ideas. And I can say that these books live on. I still have people reach out to me asking about my chapter in the climate book, telling me, oh, I read this, I thought it was so interesting. And not only do, you know, strangers or people who get access to the book ask questions, we also try to champion each other's chapters. So I know Giovanni coached the John Jackson Book Court this year, which just happened to link strongly to the chapter I'd written in the first book, and he shared my chapter with his students to read. So it's really a kind of pay it forward exercise, and that's the goal of these books and why I think they're so important and valuable.
Thank you, Emilie. And I have to say, we also cite your papers all the time. I now, whenever I'm writing a paper, try to make sure that I'm thinking about, did one of my students write about this? Is this something that I could cite? And again, I feel like this work that is coming out of these classes is so cutting edge that we have students writing about things that nobody else is writing about. So this is really filling a niche and a gap, I think, in academic writing and in policy writing, I think, itself. So I think that's true of the books in the climate change, or the papers in the climate change book, and in this book, and the book that is to come. I can really say that there are some innovative ideas in there. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, this is we really span a lot of different topics in this class. So, because the class is focused on trade and development, we're really trying to think about where the law is evolving, but then where the law can kind of connect with different aspects of international law that it's not doing so already. So how could we bring human rights more into the dialogue? If we're looking at how digital rules are evolving, are we thinking about that in the context of development? Are we looking at investment and how the rules are changing there and what implications that has for development? Same on environment and labor and the topics that we're talking about here. So I have to say both of these papers really meant a lot to me personally too, because I was doing work, or I'm still doing work on trade and gender. In fact, Emilie approached me, I think the first day of class, and said, I really want to do work on trade and gender. Can I do research with you? And so she was also, they both were my research assistants too. And I similarly was working on food security, and Giovanni and I had a similar conversation. He and I worked on a paper together. And I'm sure Emilie and I will find some projects in the future. But this paper that she wrote for the book is just fantastic. So she looks at how the EU has approached gender mainstreaming. And certainly the EU has a lot of experience in the gender area. It's often looked to as a model, but she kind of took a different twist to it. So instead of looking just at the provisions that are coming into EU trade agreements related to gender, she looked at the civil society mechanism to monitor enforcement and engagement. So how are these discussions taking place with the broader community about these gender provisions? And she looked in particular at whether they have balanced representation, what some of the challenges are to them, and found that there were a number of challenges that kind of stood in the way of the civil society mechanism really being something that could deliver its full potential, even though I think it has tremendous opportunity. Logistical challenges, business interests kind of having more of a voice, and any of us who have worked in trade policy, I think, have seen these things, but she focused in particular on how they play out in the context of gender, looking at RTAs, also looking at some recommendations for the future. So Emilie, I'm going to turn back to you to tell us about your paper and your chapter in the book. Why did you choose this topic? I mean, it's such an interesting topic, and how did you decide that this was the angle that you wanted to focus on? Tell us a bit about your paper, and it's exciting. I think we'll kind of get to this as the discussion unfolds, but you've been doing professional work in this area too, so it's really exciting to see that you looked at this when you were in class, and now this is something that's impacting your career directly. So I'm going to hand over to you and tell us about your paper. What can we find in there?
Absolutely. So I'll try to make this interesting because I know that you read the paper for those of you who've managed to get a copy of the book, and it, of course, is also available online. But I looked at improving the role of civil society in the implementation of gender-responsive EU RTAs. And the reason I came to this topic was a few different factors. So I am from Belgium, and I work in Brussels now, not at the time, but I have a strong interest in the EU side of this as a role model, but also as, I think, a group of countries that can do more and that can lead the charge. I was interested in gender when I came to Georgetown law because I had done some work on it before, but I had no idea that trade and gender was an intersection that I could explore until I worked with Professor Kuhlmann. And to focus on the implementation is also something that I decided to do because of my work with her. She really challenged us to think about, okay, not just what is there in theory, but also what is there in practice. She has this great paper on Potemkin Village, which is this idea that, you can't just be pink washing in the same way that we have greenwashing. You actually need to be enforcing the things that are that you're committed to as countries and as member states. So just to explain a little bit, to be gender responsive isn't just to include gender provisions in your RTAs, but it's to be sensitive, informed, and committed to gender equality. And civil society mechanisms are a really important factor in this because they lend themselves to a bottom-up approach, which is something Professor Kuhlmann really taught us a lot about, and the importance of including the actual stakeholders that are impacted by policy and rulemaking in your design, and not just thinking about that after the fact. So when it comes to gender-responsive trade agreements, women are best placed to provide insights into the challenges that they are facing. Like Professor Kuhlmann already said, the EU in many ways is a front-runner when it comes to trade and sustainability in its trade agreements and trade and gender. And it also has quite a robust civil society mechanism structure. So generally these are built out of kind of three parts. One is the DAG, or the Domestic Advisory Group. This is kind of the collection of civil society members on each side of the trade agreement. So if you had like EU, Japan, you'd have the EU DAG and the Japanese DAG. And there would be civil society members who come together and meet to discuss challenges, issues related to the trade agreement. Then you have the Civil Society Forum, which is kind of a bigger meeting of both sides of the civil society mechanism, so both sides of the DAG, but also civil society organizations who maybe aren't a part or don't have the resources to be committing to a regular domestic advisory group. And both of those kind of mechanisms feed into the Trade and Sustainable Development, Trade and Sustainability Committee, which is kind of the government or party side of this. This is where government representatives are discussing the Trade and Sustainable Development chapters and their implementation and impact. So this all sounds fantastic, right? This is like, hey, you have your gender provisions and you have your civil society mechanism. It all is working well. So this is what I decided to look at in my paper. There are quite a few problems when it comes to these mechanisms. I'll take a couple of them at the same time and explain them. So the first is a lack of balanced representation and a co-opting of the dialogue by business interests. So there tend to be three core constituencies of these civil society mechanisms, and those are labor, environment, and business. And women intersect with all three of those issues. So you might think, well, surely women can raise their issues when it comes to labor and environment and business. But women also have dedicated issues that only affect them and that are not able to be represented because they are drowned out in these other issues. Then there's also, in terms of the civil society organizations that take part, particularly in countries that have a strong anti-union climate, it can be really difficult to establish a civil society organization, particularly for women who are disproportionately involved in informal work and informal sectors, or who don't have the funding or are, bogged down by bureaucracy to establish these kinds of organizations that take part. And an important point to note is that only established groups can take part in domestic advisory groups. Another issue is that there's no guidelines on the composition of a domestic advisory group. There's some exceptions here, but for the most part, there's no stream-led guidance on this is how many representatives of each type of interest we need to have on both the EU side, but also the partner side. So that is one of the problems. The other, and this is a really massive one, is just the operational and logistical challenges of running something like this. So just like there's no guidelines on composition, there are no procedural guidelines on how these things should run. They are underfunded to really function properly. Typically, DAGs meet twice a year. If you think about how many issues and how many stakeholders there are that need to discuss their issues, that's impossible to get to everything. If a meeting, even if a meeting is all day, you're never going to get there. Then, I think I discussed this more in the paper, but I don't want to bore you with all the logistical and operational challenges of a DAG. But there's more to talk about there. I think the last challenge that's really key is the lack of impact. So these domestic advisory groups, civil society forum, they give advice and they raise their challenges, but none of this is binding. And when it comes to, for example, dispute settlement on a trade and sustainable development chapter, which is largely, if not entirely, unbinding, there's no involvement of the civil society mechanism. They don't have a role in this at all. So how are they supposed to be an implementation mechanism if kind of the sanction side of it and the enforcement side of it, dispute settlement side of it, doesn't involve them? So that's kind of an overview of the key challenges. I also looked at kind of what the future is going to look like and what recommendations there can be. And at the time, mind you, this paper was written a little bit of time ago, but the EU-Chile agreement was the big up-and-coming EU trade agreement that we were excited about. And in many ways it still is. It's still in the process of really entering into force. But the EU-Chile agreement has a dedicated chapter on trade and gender, which is a really exciting development. But it has no independent institutional arrangements for its enforcement. It just says, well, you can use the trade and sustainable development institutional arrangements. They have the DAG, they have the civil society forum, you can just use that. Which is a challenge because that's not how that works, and it's already bogged down with so many issues and challenges that I've just mentioned. But not to be entirely negative, I did give some recommendations in the paper, which I'd like to conclude with. So the first is balanced representation, so guidelines on how these mechanisms should be composed. This is exciting because actually in the EU-Chile agreement there is a provision that provides for this. Now, not in detail, and we'll see what actually happens in practice, but it's exciting to see that in the agreement. Next is clear guidelines and procedural rules for the functioning of the civil society mechanism. So an interesting example here is the EU-Japan agreement, which actually has procedural guidelines for its functioning, but only on the EU side. So the Japanese side of the civil society forum doesn't have those guidelines, which causes an imbalance in how this mechanism functions truly. Then you have kind of institutional and financial support. So here I think it's really important for there to be a dedicated forum to trade and gender as an issue where women's issues can and gender issues can specifically be raised and not just in the context of labor, environment, and business. And to ensure that this forum also has a sufficient link and clear pathway to the TSD committee, which is ultimately where these recommendations need to end up. And then my final kind of two recommendations were to take a whole of agreement approach to civil society mechanisms. Right now, they're largely restricted to trade and sustainable development chapters, but the entirety of a trade agreement affects civil society, not just the trade and sustainable development part of it. And more broadly than that, it's important to include civil society at every stage of the legislative process. So from the very beginning to the very end. And now the EU is pretty great at doing this, and they have taken a lot of steps. So I want to make sure that I'm ending on a good note. You know, I wrote this paper about the EU, which is a front runner when it comes to these things. And even then, there are things that they can do better. And so that's the challenge that I really wanted to make with this paper. And if you'll just let me speak for a little bit longer, sorry. I think for me, this paper has really lived on because after Georgetown Law, I joined a think tank focused on climate change. So not on gender, but on climate change, and a lot of that linked to the work I did with Professor Hillman. But I actually got to take part in the civil society mechanism. I got to go to a DAG meeting and to the Civil Society Forum, and I firsthand experienced how many different representatives there are and how difficult it is to logistically get to every issue. So I have much more appreciation for the difficulty that is implementing these things I've recommended, but I also have just recognized how much more important it is to really do these things. So I think that covers my paper quite well, and I'd love to speak more about everything I've done since then that has related to it, but I think it's time to give Giovanni the mic.
And we'll talk about that a little bit more too towards the end. What have you seen happen and change since we were in class? I do have a question for you though, if that's okay. And just a couple of quick observations. Now, hearing about your paper again, even though we talked about it so much, it's been a while, right? And I think it's interesting when you say that maybe there should be stricter guidelines on how these committees are set up. I've noticed, so as you know, we talked about it a lot in class, I try to look at domestic law sometimes too, because I think it gives us some insights into how international law can evolve. And I've seen a number of countries, when they have certain committees, specify representation. How many people should be on a committee, even what the gender balance should be, other factors that should be brought in. So I just wonder whether that might be an area for future study. Just as I think some of the other things that you pointed out might be really important areas for future study. I mean, other trade agreements, for example, have more of an institutional structure when it comes to the gender chapter. It's all kind of curious to see maybe, and I think you're right, like Europe I think has led in so many ways, but every single country still has more to learn. And I should mention too, we have this big project that we're doing with the United Nations looking at regional trade agreements across the world and trying to draw lessons from them. And one of the lessons might be too, are there other ways that trade agreements are dealing with this, maybe where they don't have that whole structure internally, but they're trying to set it up through the trade agreement, maybe that could be instructive. So I don't know, as you continue to think about how to deepen this, but here's my question for you. You said that there are issues that sometimes get pushed to the side or left out because of the way these committees work. Can you tell us just briefly what some of those issues are? What are the things that you think are falling off the table because of how this system is structured?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I think it's not just gender issues, right? It's the almost nicher you get, the more specific you get, the more difficult it is. But it's also often funding-based and resources-based. So if you look at organizations and at civil society organizations, there is a wealth of things, of sessions that they can attend and limited resources that they have. I mean, the public forum is the prime example, right? It takes a lot of resources to come to Geneva, to stay in Switzerland, and to be here for the entire week. So it's usually those issues of vulnerable communities that don't have the resources to be making their voice heard. And so I think your point about really institutionalizing this, writing this in the guidelines of case of, okay, this is the representation that you need to have. Not only does that say, okay, this is what the composition should be, but it also provides a hook to get more funding for this type of work. To say, okay, look, we need there to be this many women's organizations at the Civil Society Forum or at the DAG. How are we going to make that happen? And that's going to take funding and support. And without having that written in those guidelines, it's a lot more difficult to drum up that support. So I hope that answers your question.
Perfect. And I mean, I think some of the lessons that you have in this chapter would apply in other areas too. So I think that's also the nice thing about this book, that you can pick things from different topics where they're very specific to the topic, but they might have broader application in some of these other areas. So Giovanni, I'm going to turn to you to talk about your paper, and you focus on a topic that I think does not get enough attention, which is the connection between international trade law and food security. And in particular, you looked at it through the lens of WTO rules. I know you've done other work on other aspects of food security and looking at regional trade agreements as well. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit more in the follow-up to this. But when you wrote your paper, we had just come out of MC12, right? So we could see what the results were from MC12 on food security, where at least there was discussion, but I think that as you concluded, you can tell us more. You know, maybe things didn't go as far as they could have. Then there was some hope for MC13, so you were kind of looking ahead, but MC13 didn't really go into food security. So this still remains a big issue on the table. And in particular, you advocate for a stronger focus on equity, which really aligns with the sustainable development aspect and the definition of sustainable development, the principle of sustainable development that appears in international law, and the right to food, which brings in the human rights aspect. And I like too that you, like Emilie, have recommendations and a way forward in this kind of more short to medium term incremental change along with some bigger change. So tell us about your paper. It'd be great to hear too why you chose this topic. Why did you think that this was something worth focus? And tell us what's in your paper and what we can learn from it.
Thank you. So as for the topic, a bit along the lines of Emilie, I was interested in the nexus between trade and food security, or food issues generally, before coming to Georgetown. I had started exploring it a bit because I kind of knew in my mind that I would have liked to do a PhD after my year at Georgetown, and so I thought that that could be an interesting topic. But then when I really discovered it is when I arrived at Georgetown. I remember one of the first conversations we had was precisely about these issues. Then we broadly covered them in class, and then we delved deeper into them. But I think that one of the aspects that really attracted my attention in the beginning is that when we talk about food-related issues, the three pillars of sustainable development kind of mix together, so we don't really have an economic aspect, an environmental aspect, and a social aspect that are separate, but it kind of merge in a way. And I think that's very interesting because there's a lot of contributions out there often on very sectorial and specific issues of sustainable development, so on purely social aspects or purely environmental aspects. While I think that when we talk about food, all these aspects come together, and I find that very fascinating. On why I chose specifically food security, I think I was kind of a bit shocked by the events that happened during COVID and during especially when the conflict in Ukraine started. During both these types of events, we saw countries implementing trade restrictive measures, export restrictions, export prohibitions. There was disruption of supply chains that resulted in price spikes, in food shortages in many countries, and so that ultimately negatively impacted global food security. So on the one hand, we had that scenario, and then I was thinking, this is what is happening in the world, but we have basically two agreements at the WTO when it comes to trade, entirely devoted to food-related issues. The agreement on sanitary and phytosanitary measures, which is quite specific on food safety, but then we have the agreement on agriculture that basically covers most aspects from market access to domestic subsidies, export subsidies, and so on. So I was wondering, like, something must not be working as it should if we have this body of rules on the one hand, and then we see all these events happening in the world. And so I started looking a bit into that, and I saw that these rules, especially the rules of the Agreement on Agriculture, had long been criticized, especially by developing countries, arguing that they were actually hindering their ability to pursue food security. So I decided to look at this body of WTO rules through the lens of food security, specifically to understand what were the shortcomings affecting these rules, what countries had suggested over time to improve the rules, and ultimately what progress had been made around the 12th Ministerial Conference. So in terms of overview of the paper first, I looked essentially at the Agreement on Agriculture and at other relevant decisions and declarations adopted over time till around 2020, so till when the pandemic hit essentially, to identify the main issues relevant for food security addressed in this body of rules, to identify their shortcomings and the criticism that historically has been raised against these rules. And then I looked at the proposals submitted by the WTO members between 2020 and 2022, so before the 12th Ministerial Conference took place, to see what they had actually suggested to reform these rules to make sure that they would be more effective in advancing global food security. And after analyzing the proposals submitted by the WTO members, I turned to the actual outcomes of the 12th Ministerial Conference. And so in terms of findings, I find it was a very interesting exercise to me to really analyze all the submissions of the WTO members at the WTO in preparation of the Ministerial Conference, because the existing body of rules had really been criticized for a long time, basically for decades. So I was expecting to find really some, innovative solutions or some very concrete proposals in what countries were submitting. But I have to say, often that was not really the case. So in these submissions, there was a lot of criticism against existing rules. But then in terms of reform, most submissions were focused on very general and broad statements. So I think concrete reform proposals were a bit lacking, perhaps with two exceptions, which are, I think, two interesting examples. One is the issue of public stockholding, so the ability basically of countries to purchase and stock food and then distribute it when needed, which when it's done by countries at administered prices, so not at market prices, it can give rise to some issues under the Agreement on Agriculture, to keep it relatively straightforward. And here, there were two very interesting proposals. It's one of the few examples where actually countries submitted detailed proposals on the issues, but they were quite different and conflicting in a way. There were, on the one side, essentially the African group, the G33 group, and the African, Caribbean, Pacific group, who was suggesting to essentially amend a formula that is used to calculate the amount of domestic support used when countries adopt these measures, because they wanted to make public stockholding more easily available to more countries. And then on the other hand, there was Brazil, who instead wanted to resort to these measures to essentially least developed countries, net food importing developing countries, so the weakest countries. So this, I think, kind of shows us that we also had instances where concrete and detailed reform proposals were submitted by countries, but then the positions were so different that ultimately at the Ministerial Conference, no progress was achieved and nothing was agreed on the point. And another interesting instance where instead agreement then was reached was the issue of international food aid, where Singapore suggested to exempt purchases of food made by the World Food Programme for humanitarian purposes, to exempt them from export prohibitions and restrictions. And countries agreed on that, and ultimately there was a decision on this at the Ministerial Conference. So this was a bit the overview of country submission specifically on the existing rules. But then I think on a more perhaps positive side, I also saw in those submissions, again, dealt with in a general way, but a lot of issues and topics that I think till then did not receive so much attention in the debate surrounding the WTO, such as, for example, some countries raised the importance of sustainable agricultural production to improve global food security, and most countries stressed the importance of an inclusive vision of sustainability, so making sure to have solutions that are tailored to specific local contexts, and so avoiding having one model that should work for everyone. Several countries stressed the importance of climate change adaptation. Countries also emphasized the role of rural women in improving global food security and the importance that they have for food security, especially at the household level. Countries, including China, also addressed and discussed the negative impact for the environment of fertilizer, of pesticides. So I think a lot of new issues were brought into the debate, which are very relevant in the long term to achieve food security. But again, I feel on these issues, countries were just starting to scratch the surface. So definitely, it was the very first suggestions, and hopefully we will see more debate on these on the years to come. And then from there, I moved on to analyze what countries had actually decided on at the 12th Ministerial Conference. And no surprise, since countries had divergent views on most issues, let's say the concrete outcome at MC12 was relatively limited. So one, as I mentioned, was this decision exempting purchase of food by the World Food Programme from export prohibitions and restrictions, which is definitely a good step, but it's also limited in a way, in the sense that only the World Food Programme is included, while perhaps other humanitarian organizations might have been considered. And the decision also addresses only export prohibitions and restrictions, while there might be other trade barriers that hinder the ability of these organizations to deliver food where it is needed. And then there was also a declaration, the so-called Ministerial Declaration on Food Security, which again contains some general statements that I think are important in principle and might set the stage for future work. But essentially then countries did not really undertake any commitment despite having made this declaration. So they expressed generally a commitment to making sure that when countries adopt emergency measures to face situations like COVID-19 or like the war in Ukraine, they should make sure that those measures are only temporary, that they are implemented in a transparent way, that they are targeted, but then again, no actual commitments to reform the rules on those issues were actually made. So, so it was mainly some kind of general commitments, not really enforceable. And then there was also a third relevant document, a bit more sectorial, coming out of the 12th Ministerial Conference, considering a declaration on sanitary measures, which interestingly stressed that the SPS committee should explore how the SPS agreement should and could be used to achieve more sustainable ways of producing food, which is an interesting perspective. I'm not so sure that at the WTO the SPS committee is the best place to deal with the issue of sustainability in food production, as it is really focused on safety issues. But still, I think it was quite interesting that this outcome was also achieved. And so after concluding this analysis, I tried also to provide some suggestions on the way forward, as you were anticipating. And I think the main one is that when addressing these issues, perhaps it would be desirable to rely more on a rights-based approach. That I think would shift the conception that there is at the WTO of food as a commodity and turn it into food as an entitlement through legal hooks such as the right to food, for example. And I think that if we look at for example, the preamble of the agreement establishing the World Trade Organization, or also the preamble of the agreement on agriculture, we kind of see that this vision is already there, because both these preambles stress the concept of sustainable development, of equity. The Agreement on Agriculture talks about the importance of establishing a fair and equitable agricultural trading system, having regard to so-called non-trade concerns such as food security. So all these issues are already there and were probably in the mind of the framers, of the drafters of this agreement. And I think we should look more carefully at the words that are already there to perhaps shift a bit the approach. And then I also tried to suggest some more concrete reform proposals, as you were mentioning, through an incremental approach. Because I feel sometimes also countries in their submissions, they try to address a lot of issues from market access, domestic subsidies, and so on. And then ultimately no real tangible progress is achieved because there's too much disagreement on these issues. So I think they should probably select some topics on which there's more agreement in a way or another, such as sustainability. It was stressed by many WTO members ahead of the 12th Ministerial Conference, and try to work more closely to deliver some tangible outcomes on these, in view perhaps of at some point getting to a wider and more comprehensive reform of the Agreement on Agriculture, which however I believe it's hard to do all at once.
Thank you, Giovanni. Clearly, this was a very comprehensive and deep paper. So if you really want to learn about trade rules and food security, I really highly recommend Giovanni's work and Emilie's, of course, on the gender side. Since I asked Emilie a quick substantive question about the paper, I'm going to do that to you, and then I'm going to turn to the audience for questions. So think about your questions. One second. So this is just, I'll try to be quick with this, but it's interesting that you mentioned some of the language, I think, in the preamble, right, on the fair and equitable treatment on non-trade issues. So I just wanted to ask you quickly, though, whether you think that that reference to food security as a non-trade issue presents a little bit of a barrier. When I started working deeply on food security issues like you, something big had just happened in the world. The financial crisis had hit, and there were many, many countries that had food shortages and riots. This was in the mid-2000s. And it was kind of shocking to me that we weren't talking about food security enough in the context of trade, even though when you break down what food security is meant to be, it's improved affordability, improved access, improved availability of food. All of those things relate to trade in the market. So it seemed to me I was arguing that food security really was a central issue in trade, and that trade was a central issue in food security. But then you read this language saying that it's a non-trade issue. And I just wonder whether you feel like those things are at odds with each other a little bit, that idea of building an equity and sustainable development, but then saying, well, this is kind of a separate issue from trade. Will it ever really get the focus that it needs if we continue to think of it that way? So just briefly, if you can just respond to that, and then we'll turn to the questions.
Thank you. Well, yes, I agree with that, that it kind of constitutes a barrier, the fact that it was envisioned as a non-trade concern, and also the fact that these issues are usually mentioned in the preamble of these agreements, which, I mean, they bear not so much importance. They are usually considered also non-binding. But I think that it's quite indicative of the vision of the framers, the fact that in most of these agreements, in the preambles, there's so many references to non-trade concerns that it is true they are labeled as non-trade concerns, but still they are referenced many times in the preambles to these agreements, which means that perhaps they were intended to have an importance that then in later years was not attributed to them as it was the original intention of the drafters. But I agree that it does constitute a barrier, and perhaps this is also one of the reasons why we see that a lot of action on these issues, on food, on gender, on the end issues of trade, a lot of action is taking place outside the multilateral trading system. So we see a lot of progress in regional trade agreements in the EU and elsewhere, and more recently, especially from the EU perspective, we are also seeing the Union setting forth new unilateral or autonomous measures to unilaterally, individually pursue these goals also outside their borders through trade measures.
Thank you, Giovanni. And it's interesting to think about what the language might look like if we were drafting it today. So, okay, so you had a hand up. We'll go to you first. I think we have another microphone to pass around. I think what we'll do is take several questions at once, and then we can turn back to our two panelists to respond. so I think all the way in the back, and then we'll take a couple of the questions that are, but I saw your hand first, I promise you could go first, so please go.
No, sorry.
And tell us,
It's only good.
oh no, well then you'll go next.
He's blocking.
Okay. Well, you'll come next, we will get your question too. Would you please tell us who you are too and where you're from, just so that we have some context?
Yes, please. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Julia Chen. I've been here as a trade negotiator for 10 years in the trade development in WTO and APEC. And I think I'm very happy that Georgetown University has a center for the important topic in your new book. Congratulations. And I think in WTO, the negotiation for trade development go very, very slow. And but now we have the informal group for mixed and transgender. And my question is, how academic like Georgetown University can help or do more for WTO to make the negotiation go faster? And what is your suggestion? And what topic is your suggestion? Thank you.
Excellent. Maybe I'll have to respond on that a little bit too. Sir, since you had your hand up and you said we couldn't see you, you please go next. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Rida Faraj. I'm from Bahrain. I don't know exactly how to phrase my question, but the question is, reading or listening to you on the subject, which is trade and development, I see there are two groups, a group you belong to, who are the thinkers, and the group who are the implementers. They don't seem to be bridged between the two. They consider you dreamers, so whatever you come up, these are dreams, impossible to be implemented, resources are not available, and you consider them to be people without vision. They don't have the vision of the future. I wonder if you continue like this, you come up with good ideas, which you look forward a bit, few steps ahead, while they have to consider the problem they have in hand and the people who put them in the chairs, so they have to please them. So how we could sort of bridge between the two sides, which is very important if we want to proceed further. Thank you.
That's a great question. I think I understand exactly your approach. I'll again, maybe say a few words, but I'll ask my panelists to speak too. But I think there was another hand up. Yes, in the back.
Good afternoon. My name is Lilo Castro. I'm currently studying geopolitics and economics at university in France. And I'm also a part of many volunteer initiatives related to diplomacy and politics. My question, I have two questions actually, because as a beginner in trade and politics and all that, I face some difficulties to find how to get involved in more actions and to get to know more people and know how to get into those sectors. And I have two questions that are related to how to get young people more involved, more interested, and more informed about trade. So the first one is because it's for you, as based on your studies, you said that we can identify that there is inequalities between gender, for example, and that we don't know how to solve it, even though we have data and information from where does it come from. How could we reduce inequalities in access to those sectors? And the second one is, how could we make resources more accessible for the next generation, so it could be easier to reduce inequalities in trade? Thank you.
Excellent, great question. I think there'll be some good thoughts on that too. Well, maybe I'll turn to both of you first, and then I'll give a few comments to answer maybe the first two questions a little bit from my perspective after both of you have spoken. So, Emilie, and feel free, you don't have to answer all the questions, so just give your thoughts on the questions that you think relate to your work. So I'll turn to you first and then to Giovanni.
Yeah, I'd like to touch on this question of ambition and implementation first, because it's not the first time I hear this type of question. Actually, this week, I got asked yesterday where do you get your ambition, and then where do you get this hope when, you know, the reality seems so bleak? And my answer yesterday was that we don't have a choice. We are faced with global crises that are coming together into a state of polycrisis that are all interconnected. And we don't have a choice. We're facing these issues now, and we need to fix them now. And so being ambitious is important, because if you aim high, you will likely end up higher than if you aim low, personally. That's my opinion on ambition. But I'd also like to speak to an experience I had, which is very different to the public forum. I was in Abu Dhabi earlier this year for the ministerial conference, and the general atmosphere there was much different than the public forum, right? This is a week of ambition, of hope, of great ideas, of overly ambitious ideas, of ideas which is the right ambition. The ministerial conference from the outset felt like it was, you know, hopeless. We were not going to get anywhere. And let's just say the outcome statement left much to be desired, and the package that we saw coming out of that ministerial left much to be desired. But what I can say as someone who was there is that just below the surface, and the surface being the media attention of the WTO is lost and nothing was agreed and we're in a fragmented world, just below the surface there is an incredible amount of support from a wide variety of diverse member states who want to act on these issues, who want to do these type of things. So I think one prime example is, you know, developing countries often get accused of not wanting to act on climate change and trade. Well, there was a ministerial declaration from 72 developing countries stating we want to act on trade and climate. And yet the only thing that gets reported is the 1 or 2 member states that blocked everything. And that means that all hope is lost. So I would say, I would challenge you to look beneath the surface. And that doesn't mean it's not, you know, that it's not a challenge to do that, or that we are going to get to where we need to be as soon as we need to be there, particularly when it comes to, for example, climate change or gender equality. But it is possible, because people who want to act do exist, even within the WTO and its member states.
Do you want to answer the
Yes.
last question too?
I also, on resources, I think this is an incredibly important issue. I don't think there can ever be enough resources to get young people involved, to get women involved, to get diverse voices to spaces like this, the public forum. But there are initiatives. I mean, I can, for example, I could speak to Georgetown. I didn't have the money to pay for Georgetown, but they had a fantastic scholarship program that allowed me to take part in that program. In terms of CITV, they commit a ton of resources to allow people like me last year to come to the public forum. You have initiatives at the WTO. The Youth Trade Summit on Gender brought people from all over the world, including sponsoring some of those people to come. There's now the Young Trade Leaders Program, which is bringing young trade voices to the forum to give their opinions. I think the important thing is not just to provide the resources and to bring those people here, but to actually listen to them. And to not just say, oh, well, this young person hasn't experienced the world and they don't have my 20 years of experience. No, listen to what they're saying. They have novel ideas, they have great initiatives, and they need to be respected and listened to.
Thank you, Emilie. Okay, Giovanni, I'll turn to you. Again, the same applies. Answer whatever you wish to answer.
So I'll start perhaps on the question on the thinkers versus implementers, which I think it's a very interesting one. And I completely see that issue, especially because I think in national debates, often trade issues are a bit marginal or perhaps are not fully understood. But I think our hope with initiative like this, with this book, and more broadly with initiatives aimed at involving civil society and the community at large, it's also to convey the idea that trade and trade law, it's not really the niche that it usually looks from the outside, because I think I still have a perception that also within the community of lawyers, usually it's very hard for, let's say, people outside the field of trade law to be willing to really engage with trade lawyers, and perhaps vice versa, because there's a bit of this idea that it's a very technical subject, which is true, but I think there's ways of delivering it to make it way more accessible, and hopefully with time that will also change the view on these issues that are more at the domestic level and at the level of national politicians. And on the other questions, on the resources to get involved with younger voices, I completely agree with Emilie. There are opportunities. Perhaps it's not always so easy to find them, but there are good schools, good programs offering scholarships. If you're lucky enough to work with true professors like Professor Kuhlmann and Kuhlmann, they always hire research assistants that help them with their work. Moot courts are a great way to get involved in a subject, to learn a lot about it, and usually if there's still some students in the room, usually universities pay for those, so those are covered. There's writing competition, so it's hard, it takes time, it takes a lot of effort, but I think there are some ways to at least try to make your ideas available out there.
Thank you, Giovanni. Maybe I'll just give a few thoughts too on the first question and the second question. And maybe I'll start with the second question, which I think is a very good question. I'm glad also, Emilie, that you brought up the ministerial conference. I did not go to the ministerial conference because I was actually in Bahrain at the time of the ministerial conference. So, so I just wanted to say that I think that these conversations need to happen everywhere around the world. I think you're right, and I think I understand too part of the perspective that you bring to that question too, which is that if we keep putting all of these things into these agreements, it puts a lot of obligation on countries to have to do things, and countries that are already doing so many things, right? And so I think there is that challenge, and I think that means that there needs to be a much more serious conversation about how we're going to make that work. I would maybe add a third group, and I think you're probably right too. Academics especially are dreamers. That's kind of what we do, right? We try to envision a world, at least I think some of us do that we would want to live in and try to think about how to get there. And my classes are all very international. So I have students from all over the world trying to think about these issues from their perspectives. But I do feel like that's part of the exercise in class. We're using the law as a basis, but we're really trying to envision then what could be alongside what we know is in the legal sphere. But I think that there also maybe is another group that we sometimes don't talk about so much in a forum like this, which are those who are affected. They're not the ones thinking up the agreements necessarily or designing them. They're not the ones that have to go and implement. They're the ones who day-to-day deal with these challenges. And my work in particular, and this is something I've really tried to bring into my classes, has focused very extensively on working a lot with those who are affected by these agreements but don't have a voice in them really at all. So I've done studies throughout the African continent, for example, on how women relate to trade. Just trying to understand their day-to-day, and then put that in the context of what we do in international trade law, think about whether the rules would help them. I find that often when you approach from that perspective, you get a different view of things because you see some of the challenges that women and small businesses face. You see the challenges that certain countries face participating in the system of rules that maybe was not designed when they were at the table either. And so I guess when I think about my kind of dream scenario, I think about ways that you can really change things so that everybody has more of a voice. And it's hard to imagine some of these issues remaining on the side when we really want everybody to have a voice in the process. And as Emilie said too, and I think this again is something particular to, to their generation, I think that all of these issues now are facing young people to figure out how are we going to deal with all of these things at once. It's that problem I think that you're talking about in the government context too, sometimes or policymakers context. I think that at least what I hear from my students is that some of these challenges are felt very acutely by a younger generation. How are we going to deal with climate change? How are we going to deal with inequality? How are we going to deal with disparity across race and gender and other things? And it really behooves us to put all of these issues together whenever we're looking at anything that we do through international law. We're no longer in a place where we can just say, okay, trade is purely going to be about economics. These other things are going to be dealt with by human rights law. These are going to be dealt with by environmental law. But I think that, at least again, what I see in my students is this real desire to connect all of these pieces. And that's probably also part of the reason that there is such a push to put all of this together. But it does put a lot of a burden on different stakeholders in different countries too. And so I think that's part of the reason it's so important to have these conversations, to think about where that burden falls, where are the interests truly, how do you sometimes make tough choices or balance things or stage things between some of these areas. It's not easy. I think the path forward for all of us is not easy. But I do think it's really important that we all come together to talk about it. So I hope that at least with a project like this, it inspires some thinking. And I think that if you read the papers in this book, you'll see that some of them are very in the dreamer category. And I think that's okay. I think it's okay to look at some of this and say, well, if I could do anything, if I had the pen to recreate it, I would change it. If I had the pen to revise the technical barriers to trade agreement, I would make it different. I would make food security central to this, or gender central to this. Because I think, as you said very well too, if we do nothing, we're not going to achieve any ambition, right? We're not going to change the system if we do nothing. So maybe at least trying to think about what we could do kind of gets us somewhere. And I think, as Giovanni said earlier in his comments too, like just having this very globally diverse class with a lot of different backgrounds coming into law school. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about being in a school like Georgetown, not the only school that's like that, but just having students from all over the world, having, you know, students from the African continent and the Asian continent and Latin America all together in class trying to grapple with some of these challenges and talking about different ways things have been approached. It does give me some hope that maybe there's a different community that's starting to take shape, very different than what I found in law school. So, I don't know, I try to stay hopeful because I don't know otherwise how to sort of survive, but I think that maybe some of these things contribute in different ways, and the community point you made about community, it really made an impression on me. So going to the first question that you had too about how can Georgetown, and I think again, other schools, you know, hopefully are in this space too. I think when we created this center, I think Jennifer and I both came at this from different experiences and different perspectives, and we really just felt like there is such an urgent need to change the conversation. What can we do with whatever we have learned or whatever we can bring to the table? What can we do? Whom can we bring together? How can we try to play a positive, constructive role in all of this? And knowing that we needed to have a lot of partners and a lot of different, you know, a lot of different voices in this conversation. But I think it's really positive and powerful to be talking about this. In Washington, D.C., where we're based, I've heard a lot of these words coming around: inclusive trade, sustainable development, and I would think sometimes, well, this all sounds great, but what does this actually mean in terms of what we're going to do? Kind of your question about the implementation too. How do we go from these big ideas to what needs to happen in practice, and can we even do that? So I think we set out to try to think about some of these things and at least to push a conversation, and that's been our hope, I guess, all along, but we really felt like there was no way we were going to do this without bringing our students on that journey with us. And so I guess I would just kind of leave with a question, which is, what else can we do collectively and through some of these efforts? Are there ways that, you know, I mean, I think amplifying student voices, creating this kind of dialogue, having conversations like this, just putting these papers and ideas out there. You know, in my classes too, I try to assign things that come from all over the world. I try to find, you know, blogs and other things that are created, you know, not in the United States, not in Europe, but that are shaping this dialogue. How can we bring like much more diversity into the conversation? So I don't know, I think, you know, we're all trying to kind of grapple with what more is possible, but we're really hoping that just by spotlighting some of these things and changing who's talking about them, that at least that goes, you know, some way towards addressing them and hopefully giving our students some of the background and some of the tools so that they can then go and make a difference as they decide they want to make a difference. So I think those would be sort of my final comments. I think your questions were excellent and really kind of brought us back to why we were here. So I just wanted to say again, thank you. Thank you all for joining us. thank you, Giovanni and Emilie, and to all of the other student authors who were part of this book and who have been part of the other books. Thank you to Jennifer, for doing together and really trying to create the center. And, please tell us if there are other ideas that you have, or if there are ways that you think that more of a conversation needs to happen, places where issues you think we need to focus on, ways we should be having the discussion. We are all very open to that, and thanks so much for joining us for this session.